Hello and welcome to the Holistically Psyched podcast. I'm your host, Mariah Choate, a nationally certified school psychologist turned stay-at-home mom who now has the freedom to share what school districts don't want you to know after spending over a decade in the field of education. My goal is to help you learn all you need to know about special education that districts often gatekeep. Each episode will dive into how commonly laws are blatantly broken and tips on leveraging special education law to support best practice for students and teachers alike. We'll also feature interviews with parents and educators who are navigating these challenges head-on, along with those who are making strides to improve this broken system. This channel is for you, parents of students with suspected or diagnosed disabilities who already have or might need individualized education plans or 504 plans. It's also for teachers, counselors, and fellow school psychologists who are feeling the strain of a system that often leaves us feeling burnt out and overwhelmed. So if you're ready to learn, advocate, and empower yourself, child, or students, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to Holistically Psyched, the podcast where we explore all the behind the scenes of public education, how to support students' needs, including school, family, faith, and all the feelings in between. I'm your host, Mariah Choate, and today we are in for a heartfelt and deeply insightful episode. Our guest today is Meaghan Hampton, a licensed Christian therapist, the creative soul behind Soul Care for Families on Instagram, and the author of the Big Feelings book, Exploring Emotions Together. Meaghan is known for her compassionate and, dare I say, controversial take on Christian parenting. And today we're diving into just how she's helping families build emotionally healthy homes rooted in both faith and evidence-based research. Meaghan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. That was such a kind and fun intro. Thanks for having me.
So, Meaghan, let's start with something foundational. You've talked a lot about how modern Christian parenting can and maybe should look very different from the approaches many of us who are Christian grew up with. Can you share what you see as the biggest shift between traditional Christian parenting methods and really what you're advocating for today, and a little bit about yourself, maybe just how those shifts first started to happen and how it happened in your own parenting journey?
Sure, yeah, definitely. So when we talk about traditional Christian parenting, what we're talking about is that the parenting that was shaped by the 80s and 90s evangelical parenting models, such as like the strong-willed child or shepherding a child's heart, really emphasized strict obedience and breaking the will of a child. A lot of modalities that utilized shame or control. And so oftentimes parents were casting themselves in scriptural stories as God in the narrative, and then their children as the sinners that needed to be punished or needed to submit. And so when the goal of parenting is compliance, any type of emotional expression, especially uncomfortable emotional expression, would be seen as defiance. And that is really what we're trying to shifting from behavior management externally, and instead providing and equipping parents now with an understanding of a child's internal and developmental needs so that we can show up and give them what they need at different developmental stages. And so we're really trying to shift from control to a basis and a foundation of connection and safety, and switching from shame-based correction to grace-filled discipleship.
I love that.
Yes.
Grace-filled discipleship.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And so we want to be able to hold the tension for both authority and attunement. I think that in our polarizing culture today, people want to pit them against each other. But what the research really shows, and what I think aligns with the gospel and aligns with grace-filled discipleship, like we're talking about, is the middle road. And so what research says is that on one end of the spectrum, we have permissive parenting. And the outcomes for that, for those kids, honestly, those outcomes are not great. The same thing is also true for authoritarian parenting, which is primarily what I'm referring to when I'm talking about traditional Christian parenting in the 80s and 90s. The outcomes from those modalities are also not ideal. Whereas what we would call authoritative parenting, where there's a lot of high warmth, lots of compassion, grace, understanding, secure attachment, safe connection, but also holding those boundaries and like logical consequences for our children. Those outcomes are so much better long term. And so just encouraging Christian parents today to play the long term game instead of the short term behavior management game.
I love that. Even for myself growing up, I wouldn't say my parents were like very, very strict, but I think it was the church culture that we were in. Like I grew up very, very strict Baptist, where it's like women can't wear pants to church. You know, you had to be there Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night. Like you're there all the time. If you don't show up to church, like they're going to come knocking at your door. Like, where have you been? You know, like, are you going to come, you know, pass out gospel tracts? And I'm not saying that there's anything negative about being in the church and being really close with your community. But I think the discipline that was like in the church was very much like children need to be seen, not heard. Like even in service, right? Like I remember being in service young. Like we didn't necessarily have children's ministry even. It was like you were expected to like sit in church quietly. Yeah. It was just like the thing.
Yes, exactly. And I think that this material resonates with so many parents our age, because even if we grew up with wonderful parents, there was this movement amongst evangelicals. And I am a Christian, like you mentioned. I'm a Christian counselor. I'm deeply involved in my church. I love my community. But during the 80s and 90s, there was this wave of strict behaviorism that didn't really take childhood development into account. And I think that childhood development and psychology is a form of God's grace that can help inform how we parent our children. And it aligns really, really well with Scripture and the way that God designed us.
I love how you share about that so openly on your page too. I've seen there's like some people that really disagree. Yes. And others of us, like how I've, you know, been introduced to it, is like, oh my gosh, this makes sense. So speaking a little bit about that, how does emotional awareness and the emotional regulation, how does all of that fit into a Christ-centered home in ways that might surprise some parents?
I love this question. You have a great question. So emotional awareness is so important because emotions are not necessarily good or bad. What we, in Christian counseling, we would say that emotions are signs. And so our emotions reveal our story, our neurological development, our beliefs, our attachment patterns, our values, and our development. And so if we can really sit with the tension of our children's distressing emotions and hold space for those, we can get a glimpse into their heart. And ultimately, I think that's what a big part of discipleship is living our life in a way that, yes, we do help guide our children, and sometimes that does involve correction, but we want them to know in the same way that God extends his love and mercy toward us, we also extend that toward our children. And so holding space for their distressing emotions so that they can also learn to hold space for their distressing emotions. And a lot of times if we have a hard time holding space for our children's distressing emotions, like anger or whining or whatever it is, I mean, that's hard for most of us. I do think that does reveal maybe some woundedness that God wants to heal, either from our childhood, that could be from our family of origin, or it could be from the culture we were raised in. The origins of that could be varying from person to person. But if our children are triggering us and their emotions are triggering us, that's a form of God's grace to tell us, like, hey, I want to heal this in you so that you can learn to hold space for your children's emotions, so that they, through your modeling and your co-regulation, can learn to hold space for their own.
I love that. Yeah. I feel like my biggest example of that recently has been with potty training. Like, yes. I don't know how potty training went for you, but man. So I think, first of all, I'm surrounded by a ton of like little girls. I've had a lot of like family members, friends have girls first. It's like, oh, it's like the 3-day method and they're done. Like everything's great. And we started potty training last June with my son. And I didn't necessarily want to take like the strict approach. Like I was like, okay, like we'll introduce it. It'll be super fun. There's going to be lots of like interaction with it. We're going to read books on the potty, like all of the things, right? And my son's so happy to do it, but he just does not want to go number 2 in the potty. And so I literally the other day, and like just flash back to last year when I like you said, as God is like healing these things in us as we're holding space for their big emotions, like he gets so upset with number 2. And so I used to get so quick to anger, but now I'm so quick to like get emotional and actually get like more sad. And it's taking me like time to recognize like I'm actually not failing as a parent when he doesn't go in the potty every time. And he's not failing as a kid. Like I've never thought of him as a failure, but I'm thinking of myself as a failure. And it used to make me so angry. Now it's like starting to make me like more emotional and sad. I'd much rather get sad than angry.
Oh, 100%. Yes, I think that's beautiful. That's it, the perfect example of what I'm talking about. Yes, exactly. And we have all had those moments. Definitely.
Right. And I'm sure much more as they get older. Like you said, your kids are older than mine. So what would you say to someone who believes that discipline should look like that, quote unquote, delayed obedience is disobedience?
Yes. So it's not that I don't think obedience is important. It's just that I think that we need to take the child's development into consideration. So children's brains are still developing skills like impulse control, working memory, emotional regulation. And so a delayed response isn't necessarily defiance. And I think that there were a lot of black and white teachings in parenting culture for a while that just labeled it strictly as nope. Delayed obedience is disobedience, and so they are defying you and you have to regain control. But really, it could be like a sensory overload, or it could be emotional processing, or maybe that child has difficulty with transitioning, or maybe that child's strong will is their inborn temperament that God has given them, and it's going to be one of their greatest strengths when they're an adult. And so being able to sit with our own distress of, okay, my child isn't immediately obeying me, and knowing that I need to deal with that distress that's causing in me, instead of trying to break their will and getting them to conform to my requests or demands in a developmentally inappropriate way. And so we also get to model things like patience and guidance and empathy in those moments. But it's really an opportunity. You brought up sanctification, for us to go before the Lord and be like, oh my gosh, that was so stressful this morning getting out the door for school, and I lost my temper. God, what does that say about me? Instead of just like doubling down with our kids.
That little phrase you said of like, you don't know what that's going to turn into later for their child. Like my husband literally scripts that to me all the time with my firstborn. So when you mentioned, what is it, the willful child or something like that?
I think it's called the strong-willed child or something.
The strong-willed child, yes. Okay, so that was just way, way more popular, I think, than I now looking back like would have assumed it to be.
Yes.
And I think something we don't talk about as well, like I think we assume it in the church, but like disobedience is sinful. I think that like goes hand in hand. Where like that's why it is such an affront to parents when it's like you're disobeying, you're in sin, so we need to correct this, and I'm going to do it because I love you type of thing. There's so many truths to a lot of that in a lot of ways, but like you said, not taking the development of the child that God created in the stages that they're supposed to be taking is like a huge disservice to understanding our children.
I totally agree. Yes. And when you look at church history, there's a lot of denominations out there who encourage what they would call the age of accountability, where children, they weren't held culpable for some of their decisions in their faith journey until a certain age. I think that that is an example of what it would look like in the church to parent from a developmentally informed view. We've kind of gotten away from that in parenting. or we've kind of gotten
Yeah.
away from that in the modern church. But you're right. Obviously, we were created good, and we do have a sin nature, and we're born into a sinful world. When we look at children and we look at other groups of people as well, there are some groups, children included, that aren't able to make the same types of decisions that adults are able to make. And so being able to have empathy and compassion and understanding for them in their brain development, that they may not be held culpable for some of those decisions in the way that adults think they should be.
Right. So another area we talked about privately, specifically in relation to something that many parents want to be more intentional about, is parenting neurodivergent children with compassion, with clarity, with grace. And let me clarify, when I say neurodivergent, right, I know that term is thrown around a lot today, but I really mean the natural differences in how people's brains work, right? It means someone's brain processes, learns, and experiences the world in a different way that's not considered typical, quote unquote, typical. And that's not a bad thing, right? It's just the way that God created them. I think what people are most familiar with when using this term is autism, ADHD, dyslexia, sensory processing differences, anxiety, mood disorders, all the things. But being neurodivergent doesn't necessarily mean something's wrong. It just means the child's brain is working differently. And those differences can bring challenges. They could bring unique strengths, right? When it comes to discipline and parenting. And so that leads to the next question. How can Christian parents move away from those shame-based responses to behaviors that might be rooted in more sensory or cognitive differences that would be most beneficial for neurodivergent kids?
That's such a wonderful question, and I think it's so important, and so I love that we're talking about it. So like you said, I think that neurodivergent children do process the world differently. You could see this in like sensory seeking behaviors, emotional intensity, executive functioning differences. And so what in the past may be labeled as defiance, specifically for neurodivergent children, is often an unmet need or sensory or nervous system dysregulation. So let's take a child who is in preschool and struggles with hitting. In the past, we might people may call that sin, or say that what they're doing is wrong or bad, or they're a bad kid, and they may use shame-based parenting practices. Do we want our child hitting other children? Definitely not, right? Like, that's not ideal. But maybe they are sensory seekers. And maybe if they're not getting enough sensory stimulation, maybe that's how they're getting their needs met. Their bodies and their brains are intuitive. And so they're going to seek to get their needs met some way or another. And so if we can try to better understand our children and how God has uniquely wired them, we can then come alongside them and support them in those needs. So we can sign them up for gymnastics. We can do lots of like crashing and jump off things at home, or wrestling, deep pressure. They could play with Play-Doh. There's lots of different things that we could do to help them meet their needs. But if we just look at our children through the framework of good and bad, or sinful or not sinful, we're missing an opportunity to support and love our kids in the way that God has created them. And we want to know how God has created them. We want to know their heart. Like we talked about earlier, it's a glimpse into their heart. And so if we can kind of get to know how God has uniquely wired them, we can support them in those ways.
I think that's awesome. I saw, oh man, I don't know who the content creator was on Instagram, but he said something like, if you have like a neurodivergent child and one that's typically developing, parenting them both as if you were parenting the neurodivergent child, of like asking the questions and getting curious before assuming bad intentions from the behavior or whatever, like you're better off as a parent anyway. And so I was like, that's such a good point.
Oh, it's so good. And I love that you brought that up. The idea of assuming good intent in your kids. Well, I mean, it just takes us so far, because when we assume that our kids are doing the best they can with the skills and the capacities that they have in that moment, we're a lot less likely to lash out even if we're triggered. And like you said, we're a lot more likely to become curious and just be like, okay, like what's going on here? Let's get beneath the surface a little bit.
Yeah, it's so true. Okay, so can you give us a couple practical tools or like mindset shifts for families who are just starting to understand neurodivergence in their home?
Yes, definitely. So I think the first thing is to normalize sensory needs and regulation tools. And so I heard an occupational therapist talk about this once, where if you can imagine all of your five senses, and everybody has different sized buckets for each of their senses. So it could be their auditory bucket. Someone could have a really big bucket. They like really loud noises and it makes them feel regulated. Someone could have a teeny tiny bucket and they get really stressed out when the TV's too loud. The same thing could be true for, a tactile bucket. We talked about sensory seeking and jumping off of furniture, right? A child might not be trying to be bad. They're trying to fill their bucket. And so if we can view our children with different size sensory buckets and try to help them find adaptive ways to meet those needs, it's going to lead to a lot less of that oppositional dynamic. And then shifting away from behavioral control and moving toward nervous system support. So instead of like, okay, how do I fix this behavior? We can ask, how can I create safety for my child? And truly co-regulation is the secret weapon. So trying to focus on regulating our own nervous system so that we can be present for our dysregulated children and model the love and safety of God. And just knowing that there's so much grace for parents, because if you do have a child who is neurodivergent, their co-regulation and their onboarding of emotional regulation is going to look a little bit different than that of a neurotypical child. And so just meeting your child where they are at and entering into their world and having grace and patience for both your child and yourself.
And I think I don't know what other parents feel. I don't know how you feel. I think the patience for myself is so much more, it's way more lacking than in my kids. When in reality, I have to show the same patience for myself and the same grace to myself when I am dealing with those emotions and having to regulate myself. Because if I don't A, model that, and B, actually do the work through that, how am I really going to effectively co-regulate? I can't just like put a face on, be like, Mom's happy, everything's good. Like kids see through that. They understand that that's not true. So yeah, it really, I don't know how other parents feel, but like for me, I feel like that's almost more work sometimes than our children.
Oh, I completely relate. That's one thing that I noticed early on in my parenting journey. It seemed a lot easier for me to show grace to my kids than to myself. And I felt like if I made one little mistake, I would just beat myself up. And it took a lot of work with my Christian counselor to get to the point where I was able to say, like, you know what, if I don't want my kids to beat themselves up over their mistakes, and I don't want my kids to be like perfectionistic in the ways that I've struggled, I need to show myself grace and like model that for my kids. And so even when, like, let's say if I lose my cool with my kids or something like that, just being able to go to them and be like, hey, I'm really sorry. I messed that up. I was, dealing with my own stuff and I did not handle it well. Maybe I like raised my voice or was impatient or something like that. And just let it know, like, it's not your fault. I'm working on it and I'll do better next time. And reminding myself that I can show myself that grace, A, because Jesus shows that to me. But B, because I want my kids to treat themselves that way when they mess up, because they're going to mess up a lot and that's okay.
That's so good. I love that. I totally agree with that. Okay, so talking a lot about the emotions and emotional regulation, let's talk about your book, the Big Feelings book. I bought it off Amazon. I've been reading it to both of my sons. Like I shared before we started, I have a son that's 2, going to be 3 in July, and a 1.5-year-old. He's going to be 2 in September. I think especially my 2-year-old has taken more notice. He'll repeat parts of the book at later times. It's just really cool to see. Even if he's not communicating like fully, he'll be like, like taking a deep breath. And I'm like, are you taking a deep breath because you have a big feeling right now? And he's like, yeah.
That makes me so happy. That's so cool.
Yeah. And it's funny because he'll like correct my younger son and he'll be like, you can be mad, but you can't hit. And yeah, so it's just funny. It's really beautiful. It's practical. I think it's really helping kids and families and really parents like understand their emotions in a healthy way. So can you share a little bit just what inspired you to write this book? Was there a moment or a story that sparked it?
Sure, yeah. So when my firstborn was really young, I wanted to be able to find a book that I could read to him about big feelings and about emotional regulation. I had just started going back to graduate school, and I wanted to see if there was anything that was geared toward kids that supported some of the science behind regulation, especially co-regulation. And I couldn't really find exactly what I was looking for. I wanted something that was simple, but also developmentally appropriate. And everything felt like it was either too long and couldn't keep his attention, or too abstract, or maybe it was even parent focused. And so I just wanted something that was like short, relational, and rooted in both psychological and theological truths. Maybe not explicitly theological truths, but at least implicitly. And I didn't really find anything. And so both my kids, I think, are big feelers. I'm definitely a big feeler. I was definitely a sensitive child growing up. And so I just wrote that book for parents of children who have big feelings, where we can normalize having big feelings, give them the tools to name their feelings, because that's a big part of processing our emotions. I wanted to normalize co-regulation as the primary emotional regulation strategy for young kids, and then also just give them a couple of practical tools that they can practice, like you mentioned, the deep breathing. And so, yeah, it was really fun. I really enjoyed the process.
Yeah, it's so cute. And I love the illustrations and everything. Like you said, it's simple, it's practical, but it's like short enough where not only does it hold their attention, but they're able to quickly think back to like, oh, what was that? You know what I mean? Like, and recall kind of what they've learned in the book. I don't know if you saw in my stories yesterday, like we get like 50 books at a time from the library.
Yes, that's awesome. I love it.
And we're cycling through them all the time. So I'm commonly like bringing up the book, right? Not necessarily in like a big, oh, you're having a big emotional moment, let's sit down and read a book. But like, you know, in the quiet times throughout the day. And then he'll just reach, my 2-year-old will just reach for it. And he's like, feelings.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So it's just, like you said, I think it's like short enough. It's practical enough. I want to go back because I think you said it, one of the beginning questions, that like our feelings aren't good or bad. I think it's so interesting because I remember being a young girl and learning about like Jesus getting angry and being like, Jesus sinned. He sinned and he got angry. Like, what is that? And it took so long to balance in my brain of like, A, Jesus didn't sin by getting angry, but also like anger doesn't have to be sinful. But I think what is produced from that anger, right, can absolutely be sinful or hurtful, right? Definitely. And so I think it's a good balance in the book of understanding like it's totally okay to have those feelings, but it's what comes after having those feelings that could either be a really good day or a really hard day. And I just don't want you to have a hard day, right? Like,
yes, definitely.
Yeah. So speaking of the emotional regulation piece, how can you explain how to approach emotional regulation from both that psychological and that faith-based perspective?
Sure. Yeah. So through a theological lens, God is present in every emotional state that we have. You mentioned, Jesus feeling anger. We have the lived life of Jesus and his ministry in scripture to refer back to, and we get to see so many cool moments of when he experienced anger and grief and worry. And he invites us to bring our full selves to him. In the same way that he brought his full self to God in the garden, he wants to enter into our emotional landscape with us. And so true emotional regulation is spiritual, emotional, cognitive, and physical integration. It's holistic, like your handle. And it all brings it together. And so from a psychological lens, I would say that regulation is flexibility. So I'm a big nerd when it comes to polyvagal theory. I'm really into it. And I have a couple of graphics on my page if people are interested in learning more about it, but it's not that. I think there's a big misunderstanding out there that to be regulated means to be calm all the time. And not only is that untrue, I think it just puts so much pressure on parents. Like parenting littles is not easy, and I don't know anyone that's calm all the time. And so really regulation is flexibility, being able to get dysregulated and to go into fight or flight or freeze and then flexibly move back into that window of tolerance where you feel safe and secure. And from a theological point of view, I think we find that security in the arms of Jesus. And so I think that they both integrate together really beautifully.
Yeah, I think that's interesting how you explained going into the dysregulation state, but then being able to experience it and come back down to a more regulated state. And I'm sure, like Christian parents that are listening, like I'm sure we're all familiar with memorization of scripture and like having that, tangibly there. In those moments of dysregulation, I'm always reminded, like David cried out to God so many times. Like, yes, we look at Jesus's life, obviously, but like there were also many other people in the Bible that like literally cried out to God with big emotions, right? As grown people.
Yeah. And I think that going off of what you just shared, when we talked earlier about not viewing emotions as good or bad, if we see that like we are getting dysregulated and we don't label it as bad in our minds, but we view it with self-compassion, our nervous system naturally transitions back into that calm state much easier. It's a much quicker, more fluid process versus if we view those difficult emotions as threats, then we're more likely to stay stuck there.
That's so interesting.
Yeah,
that's cool.
And so when we just embrace our humanity, like, okay, God created me this way, I can have self-compassion for the fact that I'm feeling anxious right now, or I can have self-compassion for the fact that I just got triggered by something that's going on with my kids. That self-compassion that we can extend to ourselves because Jesus extends it to us is what enables us to kind of go back into that more regulated state.
That's so good. For listeners who might be intimidated by starting these conversations, what's one simple first step that you would recommend? Kind of like what we're talking about of like, it's okay to feel mad. It's okay to be angry, sad, but, right? Like those types of conversations.
Yes, I think that a good place to start, it's based off of Dan Siegel's work, where he has a really wonderful book that I would recommend to every parent out there called The Whole Brain Child. And he talks a lot about how, as parents, it's really natural for us to feel threatened by our kids' big feelings. And we kind of just want to shut it down. Because that way, if they don't feel distress, we don't feel distress, and we can just move on with our day. But what he teaches us and what the research points to is that when we lean in to their distressing feelings, it helps them bring it to a resolution much quicker and much easier. And then it builds their tolerance for that. So the next time they lose their board game or something like that, they are able to handle it with, they're able to regulate themselves a little bit quicker, and the next time and the next time. And so I think just I remind myself of that research regularly that like, okay, if I lean in here long term, this is going to make emotional regulation easier for my kids and easier for me. And so I think just starting with leaning into their emotions, saying, oh, I can tell that you feel sad. Yeah, that's really hard. I remember a time that I felt like that too. Or I'm here for you with your sadness. We can handle it together. Letting them know that like, emotions do come and go, and that, we're in this together. Just knowing that someone's with you in a tough moment, I think helps a lot.
And I'm thinking even of like my youngest child who he's just starting to talk, right? Those times are so hard because it's not like he can name his emotion. It's not like he's able to even process what he's feeling. He's just crying.
Yeah, he just wants mama.
Right. So like sometimes that just looks like you're holding a screaming child. They're 100%. Crying. And you're just telling them, it's okay that you're sad. I understand.
Yes.
Just patting their back. Yes. And like it takes longer, right? Slowly seeing that simmer come down. And like, okay, what will help you feel better?
Yes,
right?
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
kids have something called, well, we all do, called mirror neurons. And so
Yes.
they can pick up on our nervous system state. So exactly what you're saying, especially with younger kids too, and they're having a hard time verbalizing where they're at. They're just not able to, again, just offering your presence, like you're saying, is really the most beautiful gift that you can give your kids.
So now to probably the most controversial part. Not that we haven't talked about controversial stuff already, but I know you shared in your stories last week. I think it was just like a quick reference about your decision to originally sleep train your two children and how you learned more about development and attachment. And you actually now do not personally recommend sleep training to parents.
Yes.
So can you share a bit about this transition and maybe any evidence that enlightened your change?
Sure, yeah. So I think like many parents who are really seeking to do the best that they can with the knowledge that they have at the time, I was under the impression that by sleep training, I would be giving my children the gift of sleep. And I knew how important sleep was to their development. And I wanted to be a present mom during the day. And so I thought, well, I guess this is the right decision to make, right? And so, I waited until the developmentally appropriate window, and we did more of like a gentle method, kind of like a revised, like Ferber type method. So, my kids never like cried it out through the night, because I know sleep training means different things to different people. But then I went to grad school and started learning more about attachment. And the main thing that kids need for attachment is to feel seen, safe, and soothed. And I started thinking about sleep training, and I was like, oh crap. And so I remember going to my professor who taught that class, who is actually a good friend of mine now. And I was crying. And I was like, did I ruin my kids' attachment? Because they were still really young at this point. They were probably like 2 and 4 at this time, maybe. He was so sweet. He actually had tears in his eyes too. And he was like, no, you didn't. He's gotten to know my kids over the years too. And so he's been very kind to be like, I think your kids have a secure attachment. But he was like, no, I don't think that you did. I think that it can impact attachment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will. And so attachment is formed over thousands of daily interactions, not just one single moment. And so I like to imagine it like a puzzle. And if you have 100 puzzle pieces, sleep training is like a portion of those puzzle pieces. So if enough of those puzzle pieces are in place, then your child can still have a secure attachment, but that's still a piece of the puzzle, and so it still can't impact things if enough other puzzle pieces are also missing, if that makes sense. So if someone is thinking about sleep training, I personally would advise against it. I read quite a few research articles about sleep training and the effects long-term on attachment, and there's mixed finding. And so the research itself isn't very clear, but the research on attachment is clear when it comes to being seen, safe, and soothed. So I would advise against it. But also, with that being said, if you have sleep trained your kids, it's not the end all be all. It does not mean that your kids are going to have an insecure attachment style. We can always repair to those misattunements. And if that is something that you're even thinking of like, oh no, I would assume that you are the type of parent who is seeing, soothing, and making your child feel safe throughout the rest of the day. If you're the type of parent that's even listening to this podcast, I would just go ahead and take a deep exhale and know that it's probably fine. We are all going to make mistakes in parenting, and that's normal. We don't have to get it perfect. Dan Allender talks about good enough parenting. I think he says it's like getting it right 40% of the time or something like that. I could get that number wrong. But we're not going to get it all right, and that's okay. We're aiming for good enough, and we're leaning on Jesus to fill in the gap.
I love that. Yeah. And like I shared a little bit, us personally, I always assumed like I'd have my baby in bassinet crib, that I'd be sleep training. Like I just assumed that was going to be like, I think that's really commonly the norm, especially in Christian circles.
Yeah, for sure.
I think, Christian moms, I think it's really, really common. And then I had my son, and not only that, but I was like feeding through the night, right? Like breastfeeding. And my midwife, who also happened to be a believer, I asked her, I was like, what is the deal with sleep training? Like, when am I supposed to start that? Like, I didn't really look too much into it. It's just like friends had done it. It was like a common practice. And she kind of very gently, she's from New York too. So it's like believer, very gentle, very calm, but also she's from New York. Yeah. And so she was like, I mean, have you decided on that already? And I was like, I mean, I just assumed isn't that what most of your clients do? Like, I just assumed that helps them sleep and like that helps their development and blah, blah, blah. And then she just went into a whole backstory of like the Ferber method and who created sleep training at its core. And that's when I was like, wait a minute, like, let me go back to the beginnings on this and let me research this. But also I think as a parent, right, like you have discernment with your own child, right? And so it was listening to that discernment from the Holy Spirit of like, it doesn't really feel super right to not attend, or to attend, but then I leave when I see that like my child is so dysregulated. Yes. So yeah, we started co-sleeping after that. And then I think it was like a year and a half. I was like, I was nursing both my newborn and my son at the time. So like they're 14 months apart. I was exhausted. We were co-sleeping with my husband. Like we're all in the king size bed. And I remember getting to a point of like, babe, this is why people sleep train. Like I'm so exhausted. And like my son would wake up to nurse every time the baby would nurse. And then I had to tell him we're not nursing right now. And I had to be okay knowing that my child, like my oldest at the time, had to go through this developmental stage. Yeah. And I had to be okay with that of like, of course he's going to be really sad to go from we're nursing at nighttime to we're not nursing anymore. Right. And it wasn't just like a quick cutoff, but like that process, like I had to give myself grace. I had to give him grace. And I remember, I'll never forget, like by his two-year-old birthday, he was sleeping through the night, like no problem. And it was, when I say it was literally like an overnight thing, it was just like a switch that happened. And I'm seeing that switch happen with my other son that again is around the same age, year and a half, like what we've been talking about with other parts of parenting. It's also, in my opinion, honoring like where your child is in their development. Yeah, of knowing, of course, they're going to want you during the nighttime. Of course, they're going to want to be comforted. Of course, they're going to want to nurse. Are you going to hold boundaries? Yeah. And like, is that going to be difficult sometimes? Yeah. But it's, like I said, this too shall pass, right? Yes. Like as they get through that development.
Yes. I love what you said about meeting kids where they're at. And there is so much grace because those years when we're not getting a lot of sleep can be really, really tough on parents, both moms and dads. And for anyone who has made that decision, just know that like we were talking about, there is so much grace. Right. I do remember like when my son was probably 3 or 4, just laying down with him in his bunk bed and like us falling asleep together for months until he was like then ready to like fall asleep on his own, and like making that gradual transition and how that felt in my intuition, like you're talking about. It just felt so much more peaceful. It felt more in line with how Jesus shows up for me. And so we can always go back. We can always repair those misattunements, and there's always grace.
Right. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
So, Meaghan, this has been such a life-giving conversation. Before we wrap up, I would love to hear, what would you say to the parent listening right now who feels like they're failing emotionally, spiritually, or otherwise?
I would say that there is so much grace. There is no perfect parent. We are all, I remember my therapist saying this to me with tears in her eyes and mine. We are all going to harm our kids in some way. And there's always room for repair. There's always room for grace. And I think that what kids need more than anything is just for us to own our mistakes and for them to know that like we are going to be here for them no matter what. And we can let them in on our own journeys in a developmentally appropriate way, of course, of like, hey, this is something that mommy's working on. This is something that, that God is doing in my heart, and I'm growing in this area in the same way that you're growing in XYZ areas. And we're on this lifelong journey together. And so just knowing that in the same way that we are seeking to meet our children where they are at, God always meets you where you are at, and he does it perfectly. And he also does the same thing for your kids. And so in that sense, the pressure is off, because whether you do everything quote unquote right, or you look back and you're like, oh my gosh, I have so many regrets, ultimately, like, God is watching over your kids and taking care of your kids.
That's such a good reminder. And where can people find you, follow your work, or even pick up the Big Feelings book?
Sure, yeah. So the account that I run on Instagram is called @SoulCare4Families. It's all one word. And I just try to post parenting resources on there, both theological and psychological findings. I'm also a Christian counselor. I'm a licensed professional counselor associate in Friendswood, Texas, right outside of Houston. And so I can also meet with people via telehealth in certain states, depending on where they live. And then the Big Feelings book is available on Amazon. And so I would love for you guys to check it out.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to link the book below and your Instagram handle and all of that too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Meaghan, for your wisdom and your warmth. And to our listeners, remember, parenting, especially for neurodivergent kids or even typically developing kids, isn't about perfection. It's about connection and safety. Let grace lead the way. Thanks so much for joining me today. I would be so grateful if you could share this with anyone you can think of who works in education or happens to have a child with disabilities. If this was helpful for you, make sure to subscribe so you can hear some of the crazy and amazing stories of what is really going on behind the scenes in public education. Until next time, remember, in the famous words of Maya Angelou, each child belongs to all of us, and they bring us a tomorrow in direct relation to the responsibility we have shown to them.